My name is Jacob Sherman, and today is December 9th, 2010. I can't believe that this year is almost out. I'm at the office of Jack Herron in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, in the State Department of Education. Today we're going to interview Mr. Herron about his childhood experiences in Ethiopia and possibly his OSU experiences, because he has quite an extensive track record with OSU. First off, do we call you Dr. Herron or Jack Herron or?
Jacob, you can call me anything you want to call me.
Okay.
I have some people that call me both and call me all, and some things that are worse than that. So it doesn't matter. Call me Jack.
All right. First off, when were you born? And let's start off with your early childhood.
Yes, I was born July the 30th, 1945 in Shawnee, Oklahoma.
In Shawnee, Oklahoma?
Yes.
And what did your parents do?
Okay, at the time I was born, my father was what I call a foxhole Marine. He had been in the South Pacific and was wounded on the island of Tinian. He participated in the battles of Saipan and Tinian. So Dad had come home and was assigned to the Norman Naval Air Station Hospital when he got back. My mother was from Wewoka, so Mom and Dad actually lived, between Norman and Wewoka during that period, because Dad was convalescent in the Norman Naval Air Station Hospital. After Dad got well enough to get out of the hospital, he was assigned to the Marine Ammunition Depot in McAllister, Oklahoma, which still exists. I don't know that the Marines have it anymore. But my mother, my uncle, my brothers and sisters, we were all born in the ACH Clinic Hospital in Shawnee, Oklahoma, largely because it was the best hospital in that area of the country at that time.
So you're a classic baby boomer then?
No, believe it or not, I'm before a baby boomer.
Okay.
I think that students or children born after 1946 or 47 are baby boomers, and I'm a pre-baby boomer. So I'm really proud of that, because I don't know that I necessarily want to be described as a baby boomer.
Okay. And so your dad worked in the ammunition depot, right?
Well, again, I think Marines, when they came home, especially if they were wounded Marines, Dad earned the Purple Heart. So he had to be assigned somewhere, and the nearest Marine base was McAllister. Now, whether he actually pulled duties down there, I don't necessarily know.
Now, did he go to school after he was in the service?
Okay, no. Dad had graduated from Oklahoma A&M in 1943, and he'd already joined the Marine Corps. One of his best friends when he went into the Marine Corps was Henry Bellman, which is also another famous OSU person. They were even in some of the same battles out in the Pacific until Dad got wounded. And throughout the years, he and Senator Bellman, Governor Bellman, were really close friends. But Dad was trained as an agriculture person, and so the first job that I knew that Dad had, he was the assistant county agent, agricultural extension agent in Shawnee, Oklahoma. From there, Dad went to and took our family. We lived actually on a small acreage at Tecumseh, between Shawnee and Tecumseh. From there, we went to Tishomingo in Johnson County, where Dad was the county agent. And I was of an age and actually old enough to know Alfalfa Bill Murray, who was, the famous Alfalfa Bill. And he knew me personally. I used to talk to him every day when we'd go to town in Tishomingo. From there, Dad moved to the college at Oklahoma A&M. And Mom and Dad both like to say they graduated from A&M. They were before OSU. But Dad went to A&M as the assistant state 4-H club director for the state of Oklahoma. So that was a beautiful life for a child, because we went to 4-H club camps and county fairs and things all over the state and all over the nation. Sometimes Dad would take me on trips with him around the country. Then while we were there at Oklahoma A&M in the early 1950s, he had been friends with Dr. Bennett, of course, and they were cooking up the Point 4 program. And so when the original group was selected to go to Jimma, Ethiopia to start a school, Dad was in the original group of eight persons that went over there. So basically, I always described Dad as an agricultural specialist. He had a degree in agriculture from Oklahoma A&M. Later on, when we came home from Ethiopia, he got a master's degree from Oklahoma A&M in agriculture.
Now, how old were you when you lived in Stillwater?
Okay, well, I actually tell everybody I did 9 years in Stillwater.
Okay.
I started school in Stillwater at Will Rogers Elementary School, and then we went to Ethiopia, then we came home, and I actually went another year in Stillwater to school. And then I came back later to Oklahoma State University and spent 5 years up there as an undergraduate. So I was anywhere from probably 5 years old to 23 years old.
Okay. And what do you remember about Stillwater from your early childhood?
Well, we lived on Washington Street, right next to what was then known as McCaffrey's Drug. And this was before they built the student union and they built the library. I remember when they blocked off Washington Street and actually built the student union and built the Oklahoma State Library. After that time, Mom and Dad bought a lot from Dr. and Mrs. Bennett up on North Washington in the north part of Stillwater, and they built a house up there, which while we were in Ethiopia, we rented the house out and everything. So I remember Stillwater. We've got a person who works here in the department who's from Stillwater, and he's big on theaters. Well, I remember when there were different theaters like the Leachman and the Aggie and different theaters downtown, because Mama would let me go to the Saturday afternoon matinees. And also there was the Moonlight Drive-In Theater down there now, where I think Red Lobster and some of those, there's a shopping center there. So I remember when Stillwater High School played their basketball games in the old Armory out toward the fairgrounds. And I grew up in Gallagher Hall. I had my uncle went to Oklahoma A&M in the 30s. My dad played there in the 30s and 40s. Had a cousin who played there in the 50s, and I played there in the 60s. And so Mr. Iba just kind of always let me wander around the field house. So I probably know as much about new Stillwater, old Stillwater as anybody, because a lot of my friends that were students in those days that started to school with me at Will Rogers Elementary, and others who were in school then, we have become friends and are still friends. So I know Stillwater pretty well.
How did Mr. Iba treat you then, like as a member of a family, or?
I grew up like in the 1940s going to the all-college basketball tournament in Oklahoma City. And having done time in Norman, my granddad took me to OU football games. And then my dad took me to Oklahoma A&M basketball games. I met Bob Curlin, there when I was a youngster, and I thought, gosh, that's the tallest man I've ever seen. Well, Mr. Iba knew who I was, and he treated me great. Then when it turned out when I was in high school that I was, a decent basketball player, and he was recruiting me, he really treated me great. The thing that my wife and I laugh about is when you're a player for Mr. Iba, he never really was a fan of your girlfriends.
Yes.
But when you get married, he treats your wives great. So I called out, we had a reunion, a basketball reunion in 2007 up at Stillwater. Yeah. And I called Don Haskins in El Paso because I was kind of one who was calling the ex-players. And Don told me that he could not attend the reunion because of his health, but would I still send him the invitation? And I told him, well, Don, my wife and I just read your book on Glory Road. They did the movie Glory Road, if you're familiar with that. And Don and I had been friends throughout my whole life, and then we worked together at the Olympic trials, the Pan American trials. And Don said, yeah, he said, I got a good story to tell you. He said, up there at Stillwater when we played for Mr. Iba, we would practice 3 times a day. If there were holidays, like say the Christmas break was 2 weeks long, we'd practice all day for 2 weeks. I mean, it was brutal. And Don said one day when he was there that he had gone home and he was really in a bad mood and mad at Mr. Iba and everything, and he was telling his wife, and his wife said, honey, she said, well, his wife worked over at Whitehurst in administration. She said, Mr. Iba came over there today and said, he saw me and he knew who I was and said, he's the nicest man. So I think the world obviously of Mr. Iba, if you played there and it's Mr. Iba, and so for my whole life it's Mr. Iba. He knew who I was from the time I was 2 years old till I was a grown man and he passed away. In fact, I actually talked to Mr. Iba just a few weeks before he passed away. I even taped the conversation. I've got a tape somewhere. So he knew who I was, a great man. I went to Oklahoma State University to play basketball because Mr. Iba was the basketball coach. That's the reason I went there. And there's a whole story about that later after the Ethiopian interview. I'll tell you about it.
Okay. So you saw the building of the campus, like the heart of campus, basically Dr. Bennett's dream. As a young child, what did you think of all this construction that was going on at OSU?
Well, because Dad was in agriculture and things like horticulture and plants and things were important in our family, I always thought Oklahoma State University had the most beautiful campus you've ever seen. It was landscaped to perfection. The buildings were really nice. And of course, I refer to Gallagher Hall as the Mecca, of college basketball. And so the campus has always been beautiful, and they paid special attention to it. And of course, now I think it's as beautiful as ever.
Did you participate in 4-H yourself?
I participated in 4-H. You bet I did. With my dad being such a 4-H person, I was in 4-H probably from 4th grade on through about 7th or 8th grade. I remember things like my first project was poultry. And Dad, you could order a box of 50 chickens, little chicks. And then Dad taught me how to raise these chicks, and then we would dress them out, so to speak, butcher them and dress them and show them in the county fair and different things like that. And I actually raised those chickens, and when I was in junior high, I would sell eggs I had customers throughout the community, and I would sell eggs to them.
How old were you when you went overseas to Ethiopia?
When we first went over, I was 7 years old.
7 years old?
Yes.
And how long were you there?
We were over there about 3 years.
3 years? And this was the only 3 years that you were over there?
The only 3 years I was over there.
Could you explain for us why your dad was selected to be part of this process?
Okay, at the time, and as you can see in the picture I've got here in the room where we're talking, at the time all we really knew, all of the kids, was that our dads had been chosen to go over. Since then I have gone and interviewed some of the wives that are still living and asked about each one of the men and why was your husband there and so on and so forth. And what I've learned, first off to begin with my dad and a gentleman named Blackie Davis, who his son David Davis was at our reunion that you met or saw. Mm-hmm. D.B. Jeffrey, and he and his wife Leota were dear friends of ours, even when I was grown and married there in Stillwater. D.B. Jeffrey was in Extension. And you had other persons who were in various other areas of agriculture. And what I learned was each one of the men that were in the original group were chosen because the bosses, so to speak, they were students of a certain boss who went to Ethiopia, who had an expertise in different areas of agriculture. So to answer your question, scientifically, that's what I found out. Every man there was there because he had an expertise, and because Mr. Jeffrey probably chose to be part of the group, and Mr. Jeffrey had a hand in it. He chose my dad and Blackie Davis. And the other men, like Mr. Murray was an audiovisual specialist, and one of his bosses was in Ethiopia, and had obviously chosen him for that reason. Because of that, Mr. Murray had started out in Tripoli, Libya, and later on went home from Ethiopia, then back to Libya because his boss was in Libya. So everybody had a reason they were there. Mr. Rauch, I don't think there's any doubt he was chosen because of his expertise in coffee. And I know from reading, Jerry Gill and I are friends. Mm-hmm. Jerry was a football player when I was a basketball player, mm-hmm. and we're good friends. And reading Jerry's book, in that book you'll see that Mr. Rauch and my dad interviewed the first students at Gemma. And it tells about how they spent several days interviewing those students. And in his book he also tells how Mr. Rauch had been sent over there to become an expert in coffee and study coffee.
So what was your dad's expertise?
They labeled Dad in a publication that was put out. His area was animal husbandry. And whatever animal husbandry is, that's an agriculture term. After the first year in Gemma, we went to live in Addis Ababa for a short time. Mm-hmm. And from Addis Ababa, we moved on to Asmara, Eritrea. And Dad was sent to Eritrea to do extension work, which in Eritrea he worked with the farmers of different tribes and to teach them better ways to grow wheat and cotton. And at that same time, now that David Davis and I get together and look at pictures, our dads were working together closely in both the extension of Ethiopia and the extension of Eritrea, because as I said, we've got several pictures of our dads together.
And just for the record, Eritrea was part of Ethiopia at this time.
Eritrea, first it's important to point out that the Italians in 2 or 3 different periods of history had fought wars with or tried to conquer Ethiopia. And Eritrea at that time was its own country, split off from Ethiopia. But when the British came back in and helped liberate the country from Mussolini, and World War II was still going on, in 1952 Eritrea became federated with Ethiopia, became a part of Ethiopia. And what it really gave Ethiopia was it gave Ethiopia, Ethiopia is landlocked, it gave them seaports.
Yes.
Massawa and Assab were the two seaports in Eritrea. And up to that time, when we had lived in Ethiopia, the seaport we went to was Djibouti. And so I was very fortunate because Dad was, quote, in extension. He and the extension people got to move around and travel a little bit. So with Mother's attitude that even though school's going, or even though you're homeschooled, and I went to the DOD school on the Army base at Cagnew Station, which was Radio Marina when we moved up there, Dad took me on all these trips. So on the trips I've been on with him, I've been in the Sudan, I've been in Kenya, I've been in Somalia, I've been to Djibouti, and I've been all over Eritrea and Ethiopia. And just a phenomenal experience at that time.
That's what I heard, was that you traveled East Africa quite extensively
Yes.
as a young child.
Dad, when we were in Asmara, they furnished Dad 2 Land Rovers. And Mother actually had a Land Rover, and Dad had a Land Rover. And with the Army post there, the Army post cooperated fully with the Point 4 program. And we can go online, and I will show you some documentaries about some of that. But as a result of that, we just traveled and did very interesting things.
Now, that Army post, was that important because that was the listening to the Soviets?
Okay, at that time it was called a communication station, supposed to be top secret. But that's what its primary job was. For some reason on the plateaus of Eritrea, when you read the history, that was supposed to be the ideal spot where they could listen in on everything going on in the communist world. And so it was considered a communications place. But when we moved into Asmara, my mother, also an Oklahoma A&M graduate, was the first contract teacher for the military school there. Later the school, and it ran until about 1976, turned into quite a school. But I had Mother's contracts and everything. And on the base, we had a principal who taught the upper kids from like grades 6 through 8 or 9. And then my mother and another lady taught from kindergarten through 5th grade.
So, going back, your dad was assigned to Ethiopia in what year?
Okay, Dad went over in 1952.
And did you follow? Or
We came a few months later.
How did he explain to you guys why the move, and why are we going halfway across the world, and how did he explain to you as a child?
Okay.
What was his explanation?
Great question. And one thing my grandmother, Daisy Hargrave in Wewoke, Oklahoma, she was a teacher, great keeper of letters. And naturally, she gave those letters to me. And so my mother was a great writer of letters, and my dad was a great writer of letters, and I have all the letters. So I've been reading those letters to answer your question. First off, the pay was good for what agriculture teachers made in those days. The pay of going to was pretty good. You got, in some cases, you got things like per diem, and we were treated like royalty. I learned what it was to ride around in limos and everything, because that's the way they treated us. And so it was a good job. And Dad had always been an adventuresome type, and Mother was too. However, I know my grandfather, Hubert Hargrave, wasn't sure that he thought his family should go running off halfway around the world to Africa, like you said. Mm-hmm. And reading some of these letters, I'm not so sure at times before we went, Dad went over in the first group, and I'm not so sure when he'd ride home that Mother was sure that was a good thing to do. But they were both adventuresome types, so we took off to do it. Now, when we came home, we kids were having the time of our lives. And when we came home, after we got grown, we asked our folks, why did you come home? And they used the excuse, they said, well, we felt it would be better for you kids to come back here for your education. Even though over there we learned plenty. We had access with both parents being teachers. Mother was really good. We had access to everything. But there was a real question in the mind of my grandparents and my mother as to whether we should go. Dad was over there, rode home, told us what a great place it was, looked forward to us coming, and we did. And then after we got there, we had a great time.
Was it just you and your mother, or did you have other siblings that went over with you?
My brother, who I listed in the bio that you fixed there, my brother was not born until 1961. So I had a sister, Jan, who lives in Edmond now, and a baby sister, Cindy. Jan remembers a little bit, but she says she does not remember like me, even though she's in some of these pictures. But I had the two siblings, two sisters.
Do you remember much about actually physically going over there? And could you describe for us like your experiences of flying or traveling?
I remember the whole trip. First off, that was my first time to fly. We went up to Tulsa, got on an American Airlines. At the time that my mother went over, though, there were several other families and wives going with us on the trip. We flew from Tulsa. I think we may have had a layover in St. Louis. The next layover was Philadelphia. From Philadelphia to Buffalo, Buffalo into New York City. Fortunately, it wasn't a rough ride. I found out in those days I got airsick very easily. My sisters made fun of me, and they took pictures of me sitting there with the bag or a box on the plane when I was as sick as I could be. I've got some great pictures of that. I remember when we landed in New York City, the first night we were there, and the only night I believe, we stayed at the Waldorf Astoria. Well, again, I'd never been in anything that tall. And a bunch of us kids, David Davis was laughing about this because we all got on the elevator, and we kids forgot to even think about what room are we in. And we get down to the lobby of the Waldorf Astoria, got separated from our parents, and we were so green we weren't even sure yet how to ask where we were or how to find our way back. Fortunately, the parents found us. But when you're that young and old enough to know though what was going on, you learn in a hurry. We flew out of New York City on a TWA Constellation, which we were on a sleeper plane. So at night they pulled a sleeper thing down from the top of the plane, and I remember they strapped my oldest sister and I into that bunk, and mother and the little sister slept on their seats down below. And I remember all night it was buck and pitch and everything, and I was a little bit nauseated. So we landed on the Azores, and I got out of the bunk and I said, I've got to get off of this plane, So the stewardess took me into the terminal while they refueled, and I've got a nice postcard from the Azores that she bought me while I was in there. We flew on from the Azores to Paris, and I remember thinking, well, boy, I'm really hungry because we hadn't eaten anything in several hours, and went into the restaurant there in Orly-Field in Paris, and I ordered what I thought were going to be nice old fried eggs, and they were poached eggs, and I learned and recognized real quick the food's going to be different. From Paris, we went on to Rome, and we were supposed to have about a 3-day layover in Rome. Well, all the other kids and families were going to tour Rome. Mm-hmm. And I broke the first law of international travel. Don't drink out of the tap. Don't drink the water. I drank the water, and you know what that caused. Yeah. I was sick as a dog. So I remember being jealous of everybody else while they're touring around Rome for that 3-day period. I'm having to stay in bed because I didn't feel well. From Rome, we went to Cairo, and Cairo was still a little bit unsettled. Back in those days, Abdul Gamal Nasser had taken over, and there were machine gun nests, and there was still a little bit of fighting going on between the airport and the hotel in Cairo. So they took us with an armed guard in a caravan into the airport or into the hotel in Cairo. And I remember my mother was uneasy because they actually had somebody guarding the room we were staying in. And again, David Davis and I were talking about that. So we pretty well stuck close to the rooms there in the hotels in Cairo. Some of the men did go out, and I think one of them got mugged somewhere. But they brought us back in a day or two to the airport, put us on an Ethiopian Airlines to send us to Addis Ababa. Well, we got out over the Red Sea, and all of a sudden I looked out, and the engine was out. And fortunately, it was a twin-engine plane. So the pilot announced over the PA that we've had an engine failure. We're going to have to turn around and go back into Cairo. So I guess, again, not having flown any more than we'd flown, we weren't smart enough to be scared. But I remember when we circled back to the airport, we could see fire trucks and stuff down on the runway. And we landed without a hitch. And we gained a great respect for the American pilots who were flying Ethiopian Airlines because they were good. And this guy lands us on one engine. Well, the problem was we were looking forward to getting into Addis Ababa. They unloaded us. I remember one lady ran up and kissed the pilot and thanked him for getting us down safely. But they sent us back into Cairo, and we had to spend another day or two in Cairo while they sent another plane from Addis Ababa up to pick us up. So the new plane came up, on the way down to Addis, you usually would land in Khartoum in the Sudan, or there was another place called Wadi Hafla or something like that in the northern part of the Sudan. So we would land at Wadi Hafla on to Khartoum. Sometimes you'd land in Asmara, which was Eritrea, and then you'd go on to Addis Ababa. And we flew into Addis Ababa, and Dad met us. And at that time, they had built kind of a new palace hotel type thing for Haile Selassie. And we got to stay in the newest, best hotel you've ever seen. That night after dinner, my sisters and I were playing around the hotel, and we were chasing each other. And the hotel was so new, they had not put railing up. And one of my sisters just disappeared. And what it was, where the stairs went down to the basement, she just fell off in there, cut up her eye. Mother was mad at me, naturally, because I had let it happen, and I assured her that I'd had nothing to do with it. So after a day or two in Addis Ababa, and what I remember, and I've read this in lots of books about Ethiopia, the smell of eucalyptus burning in Addis Ababa is the prevalent thing that I remember. Also at night, the hyenas were the garbage collectors, and they would come into town and wander around on the streets, and so we'd hear the hyenas making these sounds. So we enjoyed Addis Ababa, that first trip in. So happy to see Dad. Then we flew to Jimma in an Ethiopian Airlines, where we've been flying really nice planes up till then. Okay, they put us in a bucket seater, which was an old DC-3 that sat on its tail kind of like this.
Okay.
And I remember when they loaded us on there, they put on some hides. They may have put some goats. They put some creatures on there with us. And bucket seaters in this plane, the seats were down the side of the airplane. You could strap yourself in, but they ran lengthwise. They weren't really seats. They were like a bench down the side of the plane. So we took off for Jimma. And, we're so excited. Well, when we get into Jimma to the airport, we had to buzz the runway 2 or 3 times to chase the gazelle and the creatures off the runway. And we land in Jimma. And the first thing I noticed was the Italians from World War II had abandoned a bunch of airplanes up and down the side. And boy, I was fascinated because they were fighter planes. And later on, when we'd go out to the airport for parties or whatever there in Jimma, we kids could actually play in those airplanes. And so that's what I remember. Then we drove from the airport through downtown Jimma, and we went out to the compound, which is where the Jimma Agricultural School was being established.
Oh, yes.
And we actually lived in a they had taken a building and renovated it, and the McCrarys and our family lived upstairs in this building. And as late as '02, I got online and looked up Jimma University, and that building was still there. And I could identify our apartments and things. They turned it in after we left to a classroom building.
Okay.
But Dad, like a typical agricultural thing, they had little plots where you would grow food. Well, Dad wanted to have a vegetable garden that was just ours. So I helped plant the vegetable garden. And it was really fun, to go harvest. Because when you harvest over there, everything grows large. Like we would grow radishes as big as both of my hands. It's huge. And so we kids would have fun going down. Dad taught the farmers how to grow cotton that grew 9 feet tall. And so basically that's the going over story. For better or worse, you got the whole story.
That is a good story. Did you have to get any shots before you went over, or anything like that, physical or anything like that?
That's another good story. This will be chapter 2. First off, as a youngster, when Dad was the county agent in Johnson County, when I said I knew Alfalfa Bill Murray, Dad, in those days, the county agent would do their own vaccinations of the animals because there was no vet or people couldn't hire a vet. Well, Dad had vaccinated our dog. Our dog got rabies, so I had to go through the series of rabies shots. The dog bit us. So shortly thereafter, then we moved to Stillwater, and lo and behold, here we're going to go to Ethiopia, and we took shot after shot. And I since then, I've been in the military, I've done everything, so Lord, I don't have any blood, it's got to be all shots. And the answer is yes, I still have my shot record from Ethiopia. We took every shot you could think of.
Like malaria, or?
We didn't take a malaria shot. The whole time we were over there, we took what we called our malaria tablets, which were quinine tablets. And you had to religiously take those because there were even strains of malaria over there that are really bad stuff. I've got a friend, I've never met him, I've talked to him on the phone, Dr. Kamalacher, who's a veterinarian who was in Ethiopia, and he lives in Norman, and I've talked to him on the phone, and he's told me he got one of those rare strains of malaria or something while he was over there, but we fortunately never did. We just took the quinine tablets and the malaria pills.
What did you bring from the States over there that like that, like a teddy bear or anything like that that you brought from back home, or?
Well, in those days as a kid, I didn't have much. Once we got over there and my mother kind of sized everything up, we would write to my grandparents and they would send, what we jokingly call care packages. But my granddad would send a huge trunk over and he'd fill it up with things for us kids. I'd say the major thing for your story, and I've been encouraged to write a children's book about this. My mother was a music teacher in the early days, and she taught the Ethiopians music, and she needed a piano. So we actually shipped a piano from Wewoke, Oklahoma to Jimma, Ethiopia. And that piano, it didn't show up immediately, and we found out later it sat for like 6 weeks or so on the dock in Djibouti. And when it got to us in Jimma and they were unpacking the crate, salt water poured out. And my mother thought, oh goodness, there goes my piano. And actually, it was wrapped in tar paper, and when they undid the tar paper, the piano was fine. So then as we moved from Jimma to Addis Ababa to Asmara, back to Oklahoma, that piano sat in my grandparents' house till recently. I have the piano now. And I've been intending to write a children's story about the travels of that piano from the United States on a ship to Djibouti, to Addis Ababa, to Jimma, back to Addis Ababa, because kids like to read things about that. So that was probably the most unique thing that we brought over. Now, Dad made a hunter out of me. Being a Marine sharpshooter, Dad, liked weapons and everything. Dad actually took a .22 rifle in his suitcase with him, New York, Paris, Rome, Cairo, Ethiopia. And when he'd walk up in those days, when you go up to customs, he'd just open the suitcase up and say, here it is, and they'd look at everything, close it back up. He took that rifle through with him. You know what would happen to you and me today if we had a rifle in our suitcase? Once we got over there, then we ordered a shotgun, a Remington 1100, and then we had a 30-06, and weapons. Weapons were just a big part of the whole experience because every trip we make, basically was a hunting trip. You couldn't take appliances. Dad in all the letters he would write us say, here's what you need to bring. The electric current was different over there, so the American-made appliances may not fit what they had. So we bought a lot of things when we got over there, or we ordered them special or something like that.
Did you have any idea of where Ethiopia was on a map, or?
Prior to me hearing we were going, I did not. Now, I'm pretty savvy on geography, so I got maps and globes and looked it up. So when we left, we knew where we were going.
Mm-hmm. Did you, so you first initially stayed in Jimma at that time?
Jimma was our home, yes.
Jimma was your home. Could you describe what Jimma was like at that time?
Sure. And this is one thing that I find a real difference between some of the reunion people that I see. They have slides and pictures that they took. When we went down to Jimma, it took you about an hour and a half to fly down there. But if you took the same trip by vehicle, it was a day and a half or longer. And the roads were rugged. When we got down to Jimma, I do remember we had a Land Rover, maybe a Jeep, and we had what was called a Dodge Power Wagon pickup truck. Mm-hmm. And the Power Wagon had a winch on the front. Because I made 2 or 3 trips with my parents and one time with my dad from Jimma to Addis Ababa and back to get supplies. And we would have to, the roads were rugged, I mean rugged. Mm-hmm. And we would have to actually hook that winch around trees to cross rivers and streams and everything. And the winch was a great thing because you never knew when you were going to need it to get yourself back on the road. So when we went into Jimma, it was rugged, really rugged. We only had electricity during a certain part of the day. I was talking to Ms. McCrary, and we were laughing about this because they would turn the electricity off at a certain time at night.
I knew that.
And at the same time, on the compound there at Jimma, we had no water. They trucked in the water. And the men, and I've got pictures of this, the men actually, and when I say the men, those 7 men you see right there actually drilled a well. And they brought in an Italian well person, and I remember the men set out, we were going night and day to see if we could hit a good well of water. I think they did hit water, but I'm not sure how really good it was. So the ruggedness of when the first people went in there, even in the roads out of Addis Ababa and the roads around Ethiopia, we basically traveled in riverbeds, stream beds, if we were out in the lowlands. Now, Jimma was closer to the jungle. And you could leave Jimma and be in real jungle, or you could go another direction and be down off the plateau in the lowlands and things. So we had the extremes in climate, we had the extremes in traveling conditions, and I'm kind of amused when I see pictures that some of the later Ethiopian reunion persons show where they actually took their own cars over there. Because when we first went over there, if you'd have taken an American car,
They wouldn't have survived.
they would have not, you might have been 5 miles out of Addis Ababa. You couldn't have gone any further.
Why was Jimma chosen as the technical school?
I'm sure that Haile Selassie had a great deal to do with that. If you'll read the history books, and what I've done is Mrs. McCrary has given me a series of about 4 books that were reports each year that we were over there. And with what I remembered from being a youngster and hearing the adults talk, and then interviewing Mrs. Murray and Mrs. McCrary, and in some cases Mrs. Rauch and others, they sent in a team of persons, of which Mr. Jeffrey was one of the original team, and Dr. Luther Brannon, and maybe Dr. Little, who's in this picture, who was a president down at Jimma. That team went in and worked with the Ethiopian government, and really, you do what Haile Selassie wanted you to do. And so the final decision on that, I'm sure, was up to Haile Selassie and that team of people that went in there. We would probably need to research a little bit, and we're running out of people that were alive at that time that really know totally why Jimma was picked. I had heard.
We know what Alamaya was picked.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Later on, Alamaya was picked, but if you listen to David Davis's dad had a hand in selecting Alamaya. And I had always heard this story. Other people wanted it to be other places, but there was no water. So Alamaya was picked ultimately because Mr. Davis and possibly my dad got down there and they found water down there. So it's very interesting to learn that. Now, I had told that story before, but only since David showed up and could confirm what I was saying. Well, then the books that Mrs. McCrary gave me, and I've got to go home and find them. I read them after a reunion a couple of years ago. The books tell exactly why Alamaya was picked. But as for Jimma, I think the survey team, they had an Italian compound down there with buildings that had been left. They were all grown up. I could show you pictures of where the men cleaned the ground, cut out, be like going in and cleaning out a jungle around where you're going to live, renovate the buildings. They actually went in there. Dad used to tell a story. They went in and they found Ford tractors, like 8-in and 9-in Ford tractors from 1940s vintage, and they were sitting in these fields and all grown up. And Dad and them went in, cleaned the carburetor, put in new spark plugs, put in gasoline. They started up, and you know what had happened when they ran out of gasoline? That's where they parked them. So there's all kinds of stories like that are true. They're absolutely true. But once they cleaned the compound up, now you see lots of pictures, and it was a neat place.
So it was like an Italian Army base, or?
I'm not sure it was an Army base or what the Italians had exactly used it for.
Okay.
But it had enough buildings, plus it had little cottages out there where some of the adults and their families lived in the little cottages. And I've got pictures of those things too.
Was it a village surrounding it, or?
Well, no, it was within Jimma, so Jimma was around this area.
Okay. How big of a town was Jimma at that time?
Boy, that's a good question. Numbers-wise, I've looked online to what they list Jimma at now, and I think Jimma may be a place of 100,000 people now. So I'm going to say in those days anywhere from 10, 15,000,
Okay,
something
so
like that.
Decent-sized town.
Yeah,
All right.
village, but it had a downtown area of which I can furnish you pictures and things.
So it was connected to Addis by substandard roads, or
Very substandard.
no rails or anything like that?
I don't think there was a railroad into Jim in those days.
Okay.
If we brought it in, we brought it in by airplane, or we trucked it in that Dodge Power Wagon.
So you lived in an apartment complex with the McCrearys, right?
Correct.
And was it small? Was it how many rooms? And
Beautiful. We had a dining room. We had a kind of a patio that went out and you could look out on the compound, so to speak, the school. We had at least 3 or 4 bedrooms, living room. The furniture the Italians had done a pretty good job. The Italians were rather modern, so we could gather furniture up for it. And so we just thought we were in heaven. The only problem was the stove was a wood burning stove. You just didn't have the electricity. I think Mother did have a refrigerator. It may have been a kerosene refrigerator, and so you couldn't drink the water. What little water, if any, was in the tap, you didn't dare drink it. And so that was, I think, the greatest thing when we got home was being able to go in the grocery store and buy a carton of milk that we could drink. Now, in Ethiopia, down in Asmara, there may have been milk that you could buy. Over there you had goat's milk, camel's milk. Most of the milk was that type of milk. As a youngster, I didn't necessarily like the taste of that. When we went to Addis Ababa, they did have a dairy and you could buy bottled milk. And when we went to Asmara, Asmara was a modern Italian city, and you could really buy milk and things. Plus, we had the PX on the Army post at Asmara, so we had access to American amenities. But Jimma, I felt so badly for the women, and Mrs. McCrary confirms that. They had it so tough because you go in and have to stoke wood in the stove and cook off of that every day. That was an experience. But there were banana plants growing wild. For breakfast every morning we'd have a big bowl of fruit cocktail because we did have the canned fruit cocktail. And you slice up papaya and bananas and other fruits that we had growing naturally there. Delicious. In fact, I take a bowl of that fruit cocktail every morning right now.
Did you have caretakers? Did your family have caretakers at that time?
Okay, each family usually hired what we call natives. So we had house girls and house boys. Generally, if you had 2 or 3, you would designate one to be the head caretaker, if that's the term you want to use. And so yes, every family had some.
How long were you in Jimma then?
We were down in Jimma from again September of about 52 until June of 53.
So did you see like the development of the technical school there?
That's what the men did every day. We watched every day. And a lot of the pictures that I have were pictures Dad was taking of different classes they were establishing. We had persons who were like shop teachers. We had persons who, again, Mr. Murray was an audiovisual person. Dad was animal husbandry. They were attempting to start cattle herds and do things in the area of agriculture, new breeds of chickens. So yes, every day was establishing something like that.
Mm-hmm. How were you schooled in Jimma?
Okay, going down knowing there were no schools per se. Mother took textbooks over, and we were to be homeschooled, and we were homeschooled. Mother would set up and we'd have classes every day. But frequently we kids would be frustrated and she would say, go out here, your environment is your school. And so I think we were fortunate. We were bright, intelligent kids. I could read, I learned fast. Mother always made sure we had books and tools and things like that. We were collectors. We kids were scientists. We imitated what was going on there in the tech school and the different projects and everything. So I think again it was an educational paradise. We would have, I'd have political discussions at my young age with the students there. They could not comprehend a democracy. They could not comprehend. I remember the students over there that were, and our students at the Jimma School anywhere from 15 to, 19 years old. They just could not understand why Douglas MacArthur didn't take over the government when President Truman fired him. And that was an ideological thing that I had to go over and over with them. In our country, that's not the way the government works. The president is the one in charge, and because in their country, they just thought, well, if the army wanted to take over, they'd take over. So they were probably hundreds of years behind us in technology, and then in ideology. They lived in little bands and tribes, so to speak, and we came in and more or less began to mix them. And like we had students from all over Ethiopia that would come down to the school, and they had just never done things like that. So it was an interesting experience for Americans to go in there, Americans from the USA, and try to teach them anything.
You were saying that before the interview started that your mom basically told you to get rid of your books and go out. One
day, I remember very well one day, we're sitting there and we're studying math or something, and I wanted what it was, there was a butterfly swarm that had swarmed the whole campus. And sometimes the locust swarms and butterfly swarms would last for weeks. Well, I was building a butterfly collection, and Mother was wanting me to study math, and I said, Mama, hurry up. And she said, oh, just go on. And so she set the books down and said, go ahead.
I hear you. So your mother was your primary teacher in GEMA?
In GEMA, Mother was my primary teacher.
And she got her degree at A&M.
Mother had been to A&M and was a teacher and elementary teacher.
Okay.
So she was well equipped to teach us whatever. And my grandmother's also an elementary teacher.
Did she teach the other students on?
Mother taught students there, yes.
The other American students,
Mother,
I should say.
Sometimes she taught the other American students. She also taught the Ethiopian students that were in there for the school because Mother was a music major. She taught them music and art. And they really weren't used to anyone that played the piano like Mother could, so that's why she had the piano shipped in.
Now, what kind of fun things did you do out there at GEMA? What kind of games did you play, or how did you pass time?
Well,
or kept yourself entertained?
Yeah, just go downstairs and go outside. First off, there were huge trees with a base as big as this room, and some of the men built us tree houses up in those trees. And so we kids could play around in those trees. My father would take the students on field trips, and sometimes he would take me on a field trip with him, and just go out in the countryside and be exposed to the culture over there and things like that. Hunting was phenomenal. Duck hunting, geese. They had what they call guinea. They had francolina, which were like a prairie chicken. Mm-hmm. And with Dad and I know Stanley Rauch, and there was a gentleman downtown who owned he was from Armenia, and he owned a merchandise store, and he was a big hunter. So he and my dad and Stanley Rauch and they would take us hunting, and so the hunting trips just fascinated us totally. I also collected postage stamps. Mother, in fact, in Rome had bought me a collection in a hotel. Over there they have little stamp shops in the hotels. Mm-hmm. And so it was fun to collect Ethiopian postage stamps. The insect collections, because we could turn the lights on at night till they turned the electricity off, and these huge moths would come in and attach themselves to the light. And we would collect and mount these moths, so I had a bug collection that was mounted up. Rock collections, even coin collections, to try to collect Ethiopian coins. And it was just a paradise, just anything you wanted to do. Weather, sometimes it started raining and rained forever, but other times the weather was beautiful. Temperature would stay pretty consistent unless you were in the lowlands. Mm-hmm. We did have to have jackets because we were up on a plateau a little bit, and it'd be a little cool at night.
Mm-hmm. You still have any of those collections?
I do. I would bet you that I have one of the best Ethiopian and Eritrean stamp collections in Oklahoma or in the whole country. I'm a serious stamp collector and in several stamp clubs and stuff. And I've studied, in stamp collecting or coin collecting, you reach a point where it outruns you economically because of really rare things you can't afford. Yeah. But then when you get to those points, then you can study books about them. And so I'm pretty thorough on Ethiopian and Eritrean stamps. In fact, I'm in a Norman Stamp Club. And every now and then when we do show and tell, I talk about my Ethiopian collection. So,
mm-hmm. Did you interact with any of the Ethiopian children over there?
Oh yes. In fact, for years, I remained in contact with them and would have letters and things like that. And we had an Ethiopian family or two that actually visited us in the United States. Since my parents have passed away, I'm not quite sure what happened to some of these people. But even when we moved from GEMA to Addis Ababa to Eritrea, they would write us letters and things, and I've got some of those letters in collections. My nickname is Chipper, Chipper, and so all of my friends, Ethiopian friends, would address the letters to Chipper.
How did you attain that nickname?
Well, in the comic strip, there was this comic strip called Gasoline Alley.
Okay.
And they have a character named Chipper. And I don't know if Gasoline Alley is still I don't see him in the comics much anymore. But they had a character named Chipper that was born about the same time I was, so my grandmother nicknamed me Chipper.
All right. Who were your friends over there? Like, you talk about the seven, right?
Yeah. Those students, those kids right there in the picture that we're looking at, Ladine McCrary, and she was a little bit younger, but that's her in the left-hand picture of us as grown adults now. That's Ladine at the end of the table with the cake. Next to Ladine was a kid named Keith Mitchell, and his dad was Mitchell, who's in the picture with the adults. He had a sister named Sandy Mitchell, and her back is to us in this picture here.
Yes, I see that.
Coming on around, you see me, and then to this next side of the picture, you see Stanley Rauch. Okay, I'll start at the end of the table with the cake is Ladine McCrary, and then be to Ladine's right would be the Mitchell boy, Keith Mitchell, and then Jack Herron, and then Stanley Rauch, who's looking toward me.
All right.
And then at the end of the table is my sister Jan, and then coming on around the table with the back of her head to us is my sister Cindy, and then the next girl is Sandy Mitchell, and then right on around to the right there you can see another girl's head, and that was Karen Loomis.
Okay.
Now I have that picture from other angles,
All right.
so you can see faces, but that's the one I chose to put into that collage there.
All right. And these are the fathers right here?
Okay, those were they called them the pioneers of Gemma, and it says that's the original faculty of Gemma.
All right.
And I think it pretty well speaks for itself. It tells who they are.
All right. Like that. Look at the words there.
The bottom picture, the one at the very bottom that's small, Sandy Little always brings that snake skin to the reunions.
All right.
And so I thought Sandy would enjoy. She was not at our reunion this year, but I thought that's her in the picture there. You see a little girl with a white dress?
Yes.
Okay, that's her dad holding up the snake.
That's a big snake.
And it was big, huge. Well, she has that snake skin. So I just stuck that picture on there because it's Sandy. The other picture kind of shows you the right below the 1952.
Yes.
That kind of shows you
the hills of it?
The hills of Ethiopia.
Now, Jima was up in the hills, right?
Yes. It was off the lowlands.
I believe those were created because the Nile Valley.
That's a rift.
Yeah. The
Ethiopia is in a rift, and
I know my geography, right?
It's kind of pulling apart there.
Yeah. It's pulling apart from the Red Sea, right?
Right. Well, actually, it's going toward the Red Sea, pulling apart from the rest of Ethiopia and rest of Africa.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah. And then the picture on the left with myself, Mrs. McCrary, Sandy Little, and Ladine McCrary, we were at a reunion, so we all got together to pose. And we were, at that time, I think Mrs. Rauch, Stanley's mother, might have been there, but she didn't get in the picture with us.
Okay. Now, from the looks of the pictures, from the one picture, it looked like all you guys were within at least 4 or 5 years. Is that correct?
I would say that's correct. There were a couple. Frank McCrary was Mrs. McCrary's son, and he was only 1 or 2 years old, and I don't think he got in this picture. There was another. The Loomises had a boy. There were some that were just almost babies. Now my sister, the one with the back of her head to us here, she was like 15 months. So some of the young kids did get into the birthday party, but some of the others were just literally babies.
So there was no like teenagers or anything like that?
David Davis and Stanley were probably the oldest, and I was next. So I don't think there was anybody yet that was a teenager, so to speak.
Okay. Now, could you get into like the story of David Davis was your friend, and this past reunion in October here, in October 2010, you saw him for the first time in forever.
Yes.
Can you
Yes.
briefly describe that?
What's really tough is when you've done something magic like live in Ethiopia as a youngster, and you've got all these stories to tell. A lot of times I've always felt people would think, well, you're just blowing smoke about these stories. But David Davis and his brother Kenny, they stayed in Addis where we moved to Gemma, but when we'd go to Addis, we'd stay with their family a lot. Well, we were pretty three rambunctious young men, and our mothers would give us Ethiopian money. Well, to run around Addis Ababa, you ran around in what was called a jerry, which a jerry was a little 2-horse cart. And you'd have a driver, but it was just wide enough that 3 young boys could get up in that seat. Well, we were rambunctious enough that quite frequently we'd rent our own Jerry to run around Addis Ababa. And we went everywhere. They put me in the French school with David, and I don't remember whether Kenny was there with us or not. But we went to French school. We're actually in school for a little while. And then we would go around town, and we personally, I know 3 or 4 times, ran into Haile Selassie with his entourage. And actually one time he pulled up beside us in his car, rolled the window down, and I think by then he had begun to recognize us. And he opened the door, and we stood there and talked to him. And at one time I know he said to me, "Sit right here," and I sat by him. And I remember looking around that car thinking, man, this is the king of Ethiopia. And then he would say, "Well, I've got to go," and he'd say goodbye. Well, when David showed up there, and I was trying to remember who brought David over to me, but he said, "I'm David Davis." And I said, "Well, I'm Jack Herron." And we hadn't seen each other since we were kids. And so he started telling the stories, and I said, "You're exactly right." And we told stories about how we met Haile Selassie. We actually were taken to Jerry down the street one day, and in Ethiopia in those days they would have public hangings. And we kids came upon, they'd hanged one day, they hanged 7 or 8 or 9 persons, and they were still hanging there. So you could go up and you could cruise around the emperor's palace outside the gates, and there were lions laying out on the grounds. And so we just did a lot of things in Ethiopia, had stories that we could tell together. And so finding David after all these years, and I said, "David, you go home and I want you to write these things down," because he got on the phone while we were there and called his daughter. He said, "Honey, I found another guy that was with me on all these deals, and he could verify my stories." So that's why it was such a big deal to see David.
So what kind of stories that stick out in your mind that you had that you want to share with us today?
Well, I think the main story, and you got it on the tape, but I want to tell the story again. I saw where Conrad Evans mentioned in the OSU magazine that they had 4-H in Ethiopia. Well, my father started the first 4-H club in Ethiopia. He wrote it up in a letter, and as best I can read in the letter, he started on December the 25th, 1953. And I have pictures of the students having refreshments after the ceremony, whatever Dad did to start a 4-H club. And in the letter he said that DB, which was DB Jeffrey, who was one of the administrators over there, DB is supposed to send pictures of this back to OSU. So I feel certain in some of the archives that you have, and I've been invited through the years to come into the archives and look at stuff, and I've not yet had time to go research and just see what all is in there. I feel certain again. I know I have pictures. Obviously, I would bet you guys don't have all of these pictures.
No.
And I know I have pictures and all kinds of things that we'll have copies made and we can put into the Ethiopian archives there.
Because I know just yesterday, Conrad Evans just donated like 3 boxes of materials relating to his Ethiopian experience. So we just get stuff all the time.
I recommend again, because I read a draft of a book that Dr. Kamalacher in Norman has written. And he was a veterinarian in Norman for years, but he spent about 8 years in Ethiopia. And I may be wrong on the number of years, but he was there for a long time. And he actually was there at Haile Selassie's bequest. And his account is the most accurate and best account that I have ever read. You know, you're talking to me and you said, well, what was it like when you first went in there? And I told you about the smells and the things that you did. And Dr. Kamalacher, being a veterinarian and had to fight some of the diseases and had to try to do some things with the cattle and things like that, his account is the best I've ever read. The other best account I've ever read of Ethiopia as to what it was really like was an account I found on the internet that I wouldn't know where to find it again, written by a Russian explorer in 1898. Now, unbeknownst to everybody, the Russians had a great presence in there.
Yes.
And I have read some of those Russian explorers' accounts. So I like to tell you about, okay, here's the impression when you're there, here's what it was really like in those days. It's obviously changed probably, and I'd like to, you know, I always thought I'd want to go back. Well, each time I was set to go back through the years, I've had my passport current ready to go. Some turmoil would break out over there to where I just couldn't do it when I was available. To where now, I don't know if I'm ever going to make it. I know through the museum at Houston, the University of Houston or somewhere, some of the former Ethiopian kids were over there just before our reunion in the last few months. But I don't know now if I'm ever going to be able to make it. But I have all of these memories. Again, and the thing I think I wanted to get clear to you in an interview like we're doing is that when we went in and you asked me the question, I'm telling you it was rugged. So I don't know that the people who came after us, mid 50s, 60s, and so on and so forth, really will understand what these mothers that went in there, most of these men, if you knew the men, they were military veterans, they were really tough guys. And my
they
mother
experienced
my mother,
sort of ruggedness.
That's right. My mother always said, I think they chose the people that went over there because the dads, were rugged people, and we were there at a rugged time. And we never felt threatened, we never felt afraid. Again, we had dads, my dad's a combat veteran, and we had dads that we felt could take care of us. Bob Loomis, Jim Murray were just as rugged a men as you'd ever run into. So I think that was the big thing, but they did a darn good job of taking care of us children. Now, I always admired Stanley Rauch because I got a figure that Stanley Rauch and Mr. Rauch had the greatest knowledge of biology of Ethiopia of anyone that ever lived. Because Stanley came home, went to school over here, went back to Ethiopia, and spent many years wandering around Ethiopia. And I think Stanley was a biology major. I'd have to see what he got his PhD in. And of course, with Mr. Rauch and coffee, and Jimma, Ethiopia, I bought a book on coffee one time, and they said coffee was discovered or originated in the Abyssinian highlands. Well, there's the Abyssinian highlands right there. And coffee was a big deal, and Mr. Rauch was the expert. So I was taught in an academic setting that you always deferred to those who had the expertise, who'd actually done it. And so I had a great respect for Stanley, because biology-wise, wandering around the country as he did, the guy had to have a lot of knowledge. And I felt so bad because really, I'm still here, but Stanley died at a rather young age. And you just think of the knowledge that these men had when they passed away. So I think my goal would be to carry it on. I'll give one example. I noticed recently in an Ethiopian bulletin where a gentleman named Brian Glass had passed away. And I want this to be on interview because I want this to be known. I was there in school, and I made a point to go over to Mr. Glass and try to talk to him and communicate about the animals in Ethiopia. Because I've been all over. Dad and I have hunted. We brought home like 15, 17 African trophies. I've got pictures that'll show you crocodiles swimming down a river that look like battleships. And so I found Mr. Glass to not be very friendly toward me or even want to pay any attention to any expertise that I might have. And I always wondered, well, why was it this way? Except some of the adults I've interviewed said, well, everybody over there had a book in mind, and some of them were very guarded of their turf and everything, and they didn't want anybody else to be perceived as an expert. So for that reason, if everyone regards Brian Glass as the expert on the animal life of Ethiopia, there's others of us that were there that I've slept out there, hunted them. I learned the native names for things. I know when I was talking to Brian, I would give him the name of something, and he would give me some scientific name, and I didn't quite know what he was talking about, but I knew what the natives of Ethiopia called the creatures. And I've even picked up books that when you moved into Eritrea, the Army would give you a book on here's what you can expect, and those are the names that I knew. So that was something I wanted to get across. I think the other thing that I want to repeat again, for the sake of the interview about Ethiopia, there's very little written, and Jerry Gill and I have talked about the adventure into Eritrea. Now, since then I found out there may have been other people who went into Eritrea, but Dad was really the pioneer. We were the pioneers in Eritrea, and he was sent there to do extension. And I've seen some reports that said the extension program in Eritrea was not a success. Hogwash. I've got pictures of field day, where Dad would bring all the farmers in for field days and everything. I read a National Geographic magazine written in the 1960s, and I have been able to collect every National Geographic that I could find anywhere, and I've had an index of them about Ethiopia from the first National Geographic up until the mid 80s.
Yes.
And there were a few that may have been written 1900 or before that I haven't been able to find. Now you can get online and read all of them, so there's no need to collect them anymore. But in one of the ones written in 1965 there was an article about what they call the cotton baron of Eritrea. And he was an Italian businessman who went into Eritrea and developed the cotton and put in cotton gins and harvested cotton and made a fortune. Well, I want to tell you, my dad is the person who went in there in the 1950s, the early 1950s, and taught him how to grow cotton. So I think that man came in and reaped the benefits of all of the extension work that Dad did. Now, over right across the border in the Sudan, believe it or not, was a large, huge Italian cotton plantation. And I have pictures of my dad. I actually have movies of my dad over there. We would go out there and visit frequently. And I have pictures of Dad down at Massawa at the seaport helping the natives push and load big bales of cotton. So the extent of what Dad really did, I think, went kind of underreported. The other big thing was, and you hit this just right, Cagnew Station was known as Radio Marina when we got there. And then when the Ethiopians federated with them, they changed the name in about August or September of '53. They changed the name from Radio Marina to Cagnew Station. And so Cagnew Station is a historical thing of its own. And with Mother being the first contract teacher for the elementary school there, and then all the things that participated, and you need to read a history. You can go online and just look up Cagnew Station, and there's a whole history there. And they issued a paper called the Gazelle, and you can find my dad mentioned in some of those gazelles and everything. So we had Jimma, we had Addis Ababa, and we had Asmara. And those are really three different stories in the whole Ethiopian experience. Now, for David Davis to show up and have those pictures of my dad and the pictures with his dad, I think it shows how closely the extension agent in Ethiopia worked with the extension agent in Eritrea. And you know, Dad would leave sometimes when Mother wouldn't let me go, and he'd be gone for several days, and I think he and Mr. Davis were hooked up somewhere, either in Eritrea or Ethiopia, working on all this stuff.
So how long were you in Addis?
Okay, we were in Addis about 3 months.
3 months?
Yeah, when we left Jimma, and there was just a period there in Addis where they were setting everything up to go to Asmara. So Mom and Dad were still worried about school. That's when I got into French school. But Dad did take me, he and Mr. Jeffrey took me on a trip to Asmara, kind of a scouting trip.
Okay.
And I've got their account of what all we found and everything. And so we were excited then about going to Asmara. And so I think Dad may have driven up to Asmara and brought, you know, things that we had, personal belongings, that piano, brought them in by road. And then Mother and I and my sisters flew Ethiopian Airlines into Asmara. Now, later on, after we were in Asmara, that's where Dad had the Land Rovers, and that's where we took some tremendous trips. We would go down to Massawa, the seaport, and then we would hunt the lowlands along the Red Sea. We'd go from Massawa down to Assab, which is a seaport, from Assab back to Dessie, and then we took trips from Dessie to Addis Ababa, down to Jimma. From Jimma, we went another route down into Kenya, along the Kenyan-Somalian border, back up to Harar, and back in that way and everything. Then I've got letters that they wrote home, and it was really funny because Mother would say in a letter that they said Jack Herron came through Jimma and they were on their way up the Nile River, the Blue Nile, to Khartoum. But we actually, on this one big trip, about a 35-day trip, we went up the Blue Nile and went into the Sudan up to Khartoum, back across to Tessenay and back into Asmara.
Was it easy to get across the borders at that time?
The Land Rovers that Dad had a big flag on the front, USA, and I've got a picture of the front and back of the Land Rovers. And then Dad made friends with a military man named Major Buck Reed. Well, Buck Reed, again, was a legend over there, and a big hunter and everything. And so when we would take off, we'd usually have a Land Rover, a military Jeep. Dad had working for him an Italian mechanic that could fix anything. And we also had a photographer from the military base. So when we pull up to a checkpoint to go into Kenya or go into Somalia, well, Major Reed would put on his hat, you know, that looked like something out of Crocodile Dundee. And boy, we would just drive up and Major Reed would salute him. And of course, we had the Ethiopian driver's license papers right on through. So we had no problem. Absolutely no problem. In Ethiopia, they actually have a part of the country that was a gold mining. You know, they mined gold. And they were supposed to be really strict with security getting in there. I have been in there. I have been in. They just let us through. So in those days, I guess if you ran a good enough bluff and you act like you're supposed to be there, they would let us in. And so So the answer to your question is no, we didn't have any trouble. We went where we wanted to go, when we wanted to go. Now, here's another thing. I think you may have heard about from some of the persons over there about these monasteries that are up in the tops of plateaus where males were the only persons allowed up there. They would actually lift us up in baskets and we would visit these places.
Wow.
So there was one of those in Eritrea and there's some in Ethiopia also.
How long were you in Eritrea?
We were in Eritrea about a year and a half.
Your dad worked with the military people, or?
The military people more or less just adopted us.
Okay.
Dad's office was right across the road there in Asmara from the American consulate, and there were other persons there that were there other than the Point 4 program. We had 2 or 3 people from all over the country that were agricultural specialists, and they worked with Dad.
So you went to school at Asmara then?
Okay, in Asmara, they decided they wanted to have a dependent military school, Department of Defense military school on the base. Up to then, military parents had taught the kids. So they advertised for a teacher, and Mother applied for the job, and I have her contract and everything, to do it. I have report cards from Radio Marina, and Mother was the first contract teacher. They hired 2 other teachers who were from Michigan. Their names were Benjamin, Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin. So it was a 3-teacher school for all the dependent kids there, and they allowed some of the Americans, like we had persons whose dads were pilots for different airlines that lived there in Asmara. So basically, if you were an American kid, you could go to the DOD school on base.
How big was Asmara?
I'm going to guess Asmara was over 100,000 population.
As big as Addis, or?
Not quite as big as Addis, but a big, modern, sprawling, beautiful boulevards. The Italian influence.
Yeah, they built it.
Eritrea had been more or less a resort getaway for Italians for 100 years, And so a lot of those people were born there, lived there, that were Italian. They just lived in the country for years and years and years. So Eritrea, even though when you got away from Asmara was rugged, it was a different place than what Ethiopia was.
I heard the Italians, what roads that Ethiopia had, the Italians, they were just
That's correct.
Extravagant.
Asphalt roads, they were nice. And they built, in some cases they built aqueducts, in some cases they built special bridges that were just really neat engineering feats, of which I have pictures of all these.
Do you participate in celebrating typical American customs over there, right? Birthdays, Halloween, Christmases.
Okay. My primary fear, you asked when we found out we were going, if we knew where Ethiopia was, my primary fear was that Santa Claus wouldn't know where I was. And so we wrote letters to Santa, which I have those letters. I could write, my sisters couldn't write. And in the letter I told Santa what I wanted. Now, when I was a kid, a Ford Apache set was a big deal. I also wanted an airplane like TWA or Pan American. I wanted one of those airplanes. I wanted a basketball. And so when I went downstairs, we lived in a 2-story bungalow in Asmara, the first place we lived. And when I went downstairs on Christmas morning, and there was my Ford Apache set in that airplane, I knew that Santa knew where we were. So we celebrated the normal holidays, but over there we learned there were so many different cultures. They would celebrate on a little different day, a form of Christmas. And then you had so many different religions that, the Muslims fasted, and all my friends, I had friends of every persuasion. And so we just learned to accept their customs, and they accepted ours, and I've been invited to their homes for whatever we did. Dad really was very popular with the natives, because whenever we went to a village, he knew the chief, and we would go right in and squat down in their tugal, and we would partake in whatever food they ate. I still get invited over here to go to celebrations, and I like injera, and I like wat, and I like the different foods that they fix. So because there was a makeup of many cultures, yes, we had different holidays, we had different things that we celebrated. And sometimes it made it tough, because at times when we were eating different foods, they couldn't eat those foods.
Was it easy for you to get used to Ethiopian food, or?
You can tell by looking at me now that I've never missed very many meals. And I was the same way then. Like I say, I paid a price in Rome because I was not careful.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm still impacted by some of the intestinal things I might have picked up over there.
Was it overall, was it an easy adjustment as you being a child? Or
Yeah, had no problem at all.
had no problems?
Children are children, young adults are young adults. The students we had on the school, again, when we came home for a period of years, many of them were friends of mine. I do not know what's happened to them now, or they probably know with me. But we could communicate quickly. You learned a mixture of about 3 languages that I put on your biography there. Everything was a mixture of Amharic and English and Italian.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we got to Asmara, the University of Maryland had established a contract with Cagnew Station to teach courses. Well, the first thing Mother did when we got to Asmara was enrolled in a conversational Italian course. As a result, she took us kids with her. So quickly, the only other language over there was Tigray, but Amharic was pretty universal. Mm-hmm. And then you mixed Amharic with the Italian you learned. I bet there's a lot of words now if you go to Ethiopia. I have fun now when I have a taxi cab driver from there, or I'm in a hotel, and some of the persons there were from Ethiopia. It's fun to say something to them. Boy, their eyes, they look at you. Pretty soon it helps establish a rapport because then they want to talk about different things. So we children had no problems mixing with the other persons.
Did you miss anything American-wise when you were over there?
We got to Asmara in the military base, and comic books. Every week there would be a selection of comic books come into the PX, and Mother would buy one of each for all of us. And so we missed the comic books, but for us kids, reading those comic books, that was another way you could stay Americanized. They had a theater there on the post, and we would go watch American theaters. Well, usually in those days you'd have the cartoons before the main performance. Then you'd also have a newsreel type deal. So it was better when we got to Asmara because we could read the newsreels and see what was going on in the U.S. At that time, OU had started their 47-game winning streak, and you knew what was going on in sports. Dad took a lot of ribbing because OU would beat A&M so badly in football, but he said, well, wait till basketball gets here, we'll get even. Down in Jimma, through letters was the only way we had of knowing what the outside world was doing. But amazingly, we didn't really care.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were at that base during the height of the Cold War. Did you feel any Cold War implications?
No, but good question. Absolutely not. Again, Americans were still very popular. Ethiopia and Eritrea had just federated, so we had the full backing of Haile Selassie. He visited the base a couple of times while we were there, and I would say no. Here's what I wanted to mention too. You asked about things though. I had requested a basketball. Mm-hmm. I got my Ford Apache set. I got my airplane. My granddad had sent a huge trunk. And of course, those trunks, there's no telling how long it took to get there. Mm-hmm. The basketball was gone. Somebody, somewhere, when they opened that trunk for customs, and it was a nice leather basketball that would have said Oklahoma A&M on it because he got it from Mr. Iba. Basketball wasn't there. Aww. So the basketball didn't make it.
But the piano did.
The piano did. So somebody somewhere got a nice basketball.
That's right. Did you personally record your stay? Like, did you write diary or anything like that?
I've got stuff, yes. I have stuff in my handwriting that I kept. Again, I've got a pretty good... Mother actually wrote journals of the whole deal.
Mm-hmm. But you didn't personally, like, today?
No, I did. I did.
Yeah,
I've got some, yes.
Okay. And you wrote back home to your grandparents?
That's what I would do is I would send to my grandparents and tell them, what we were doing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the spelling may be a little lacking, but I told the story. I even wrote a story about a hunting trip that I still have.
Wow. I know later on they had Armed Forces Post Office. Did privileges, did you guys have that?
We didn't have franking privileges. Down in Jimma, Mrs. Murray and I talked about this because Mrs. Murray was a stamp collector. Down in Jimma, you went down to a building that was supposed to be the post office. The postmaster had a little lockbox that he kept the Ethiopian stamps in. Mm-hmm. That was the post office in Jimma. But you could buy the stamps and you could mail things out with him. There would usually be what we called a pouch. that was kind of a diplomatic pouch. That sometimes it would go from the college to Addis, and from Addis it would get mailed home somehow. We'd put stuff in the diplomatic pouch, but we would put postage on it. So I have letters that are actually canceled in Washington, D.C., and it would have a stamp on there, and when I say a stamp, it would have a rubber stamp on it that would say, this item was canceled in the country where it was originally mailed, which would indicate that it came from Ethiopia. Now, the post office box, the military post office box in Cagnew Station is kind of rare because it's been discontinued.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it was like post office box 843. And so when I started collecting really seriously when I was an adult, I wanted to make sure that my envelopes and things, and I've got a lot of APO 843. Mm-hmm. But I have some that are postmarked in Jimma, some that are postmarked in Addis Ababa, some that are postmarked in Asmara, some that were sent through the diplomatic pouch and postmarked in Washington, D.C., and you have all of those different ways of getting things over here.
Did you come back from the States at any time, or was this straight
We
shot?
stayed straight through. Some of them did come home for vacations.
Okay.
I think I talked to Stanley, and they may have come home for a vacation. When we got ready to come home, Dad, being in the South Pacific during World War II, Dad had thought it might be neat to go home the Pacific route.
Mm-hmm.
Mother said, no, we're touring Europe. So we actually left Asmara. I remember we went to Khartoum, Wadi Halfa, Cairo, Athens, Rome, Florence, Milan, Zurich, Munich, Germany, and all over Germany and Austria, Holland, Belgium, across the English Channel to England, spent several days in London and around England, went over to Ireland, caught a plane out of Shannon, Ireland. I think we landed at some airbase in Nova Scotia because Gander Field was fogged in. And that's the first time I had ever seen jet airplanes, fighters. They had them sitting there on the airbase. And they were, we knew they had invented them during this period when we were going over. But that's the first ones I'd ever seen. I've got a little metal airplane. It's like the first ones I saw, kind of a Super Sabre jet. But then we left out of, it was St. John's, Newfoundland, I think is where we landed. We left out of St. John's, flew down, circled Boston a time or two, headed on down to New York, and I will never forget the beauty of the Statue of Liberty. And then we landed in July in New York City, kissed the asphalt when we got off that airplane, went into town, stayed in a big hotel, but could go down to a grocery store that was on the street, which was a drugstore, grocery store, downtown Manhattan. Mm-hmm. Walked in and could drink milk out of a carton and not feel you were going to get sick. And you walk down the street and everybody spoke English, most everybody. Toured everything. I went to my first Major League Baseball game in the Polo Grounds. Took a train from New York City to Detroit, cross country, train. Dad had ordered a new car there in Detroit, bought the car and drove home to Oklahoma. Never been so happy in my life.
Now, did you have to make any adjustments coming back to the States?
None. No. Everybody, I gave lots of talks like I'm doing with you. Everybody in school and everywhere wanted to hear about Ethiopia. And I had me a slide presentation, and boy, could we knock it off. And I feel badly now because I don't know that all those kids were interested in all that stuff, but we like to talk about it.
Oh, yeah. As you look back, how do you feel about your Ethiopian experience?
Great experience, trip of a lifetime. My wife, who's from Norman, Oklahoma, we'd actually gone to grade school together, didn't know each other till high school. But her dad was in Alaska for the Korean War during that period. And so she lived in Alaska when I lived in Ethiopia, so we tell each other lots of stories about it and everything. Great experience. Would not trade for it. Glad we did it.
Did you feel behind in school-wise?
Never.
You were up to...
We're bright enough and Mother was good enough, and what I've learned in education is you can catch up in a hurry. And I don't know if you're ever really behind. If you'll just, whatever material you want to study, just study it and keep on trucking.
How did this experience impact your life?
Well, one big deal was when we got to Asmara, the military base, athletics was big. And with Dad being a former Oklahoma A&M ball player, they wanted him to participate in everything. And so when the men would be out there playing basketball at halftime, and we played outdoors at night, when the men would be off at halftime, the kids could get out and play ball. Well, softball was big, basketball was big, flag football was big. So really and truly, we came home, and I remember when Dad came to see me one time and he said they're having basketball tryouts at the Stillwater Junior High. Do you want to try out? And I said, sure. You know, this is my first experience with Little League basketball. So we went down there and we sat around what's now the old junior high. You go way down there, it's an old building. I think it still exists in Stillwater. Not what, now it's a civic center, you know. You go on down the street, there's another building that was a junior high in those days, way on south. And we sit out in this old gym that was kind of down in the basement. And I remember kids were running up and down. The coaches had them divided into teams. They were running up and down for 2 or 3 hours. And I sat over there all hunkered down waiting on my turn. Well, finally, after a couple of hours, this man comes over and says, okay, it's your turn, get in there. Well, here were these kids, young kids, could run up and down and couldn't even throw the ball in the basket. Partner, I could throw it in the basket. And so, man, all of a sudden, everybody's watching. It gets real quiet because, man, so I remember when it was over, these men came over to me and said, where'd you learn how to do that? Well, you know where I learned how to do it? On my granddad's farm and in Cagnew Station in Asbury Air Tree. Because the kids got to get out there and we had a chance to play. So that was one of the big impacts it had, really, if you're going to look at sports and sports being important. The other thing was the knowledge of other cultures and the worldwide knowledge of being in other countries and knowing languages and knowing other people and knowing, you know, really what the world was about. Tremendous impact.
Mm-hmm. What do you think overall the legacy of the OSU Ethiopia involvement was?
I think we, to some extent, achieved what we went in for. You know, we went in to expose them to better agricultural methods and techniques, and we did, and it was successful. Because of political consequences, you know, eventually Haile Selassie ceased to be, and other forms of government took over, and actually, you know, the Cuban communists had a great influence, and we know the Russians had a great influence even when we were there. And so the impact of all of that, and with the passage of time now, other than someone like you documenting this, and with everything that all the rest of us tell, I'm not sure that a great deal will be remembered, because now the ones that were there in Jimma in the early days were history. So from that standpoint, I'm not sure that 100 years or 200 years up the road anyone will really know or remember what we did. But when I look back on that period from the early 1950s to the late 1960s, there's no doubt about the impact that we had. And many of those students have come over here. They've gotten advanced degrees. Some of them are now leading businessmen and scientists all over the world. And so that was a worthwhile project. We learned a great deal from a standpoint of, I'm not sure that the adults, if they had to do over again, would do it exactly the same way. There were things that we could probably have done better. But, you know, hindsight on everything is, hindsight's 20/20.
Now, is there anything that we haven't discussed about your Ethiopian experience that you would like to share with us?
No, my own reason for ever wanting to share anything on it is I think there have been some people who just made a career out of Ethiopia. Well, it's like the military. Some of us came home and moved on to other things. But I just want everybody to know there were others of us over there. And I don't know that this group of 7 men here really get to do that, get what they're due because of what they really did. The early publication that called them the pioneers of Jimma, they really were pioneers. I mean, we're in there, and like Mother said, it was a matter of survival. You know, every day we had to learn how to survive in a hostile foreign culture. These were the first Americans really, to any extent, that had ever been over there. And so from that standpoint, I'm sorry that we're all old and dead and passing on. And so since I'm still around, and I've talked to Sandy Little and Ladine about it, and they said, Jack, we want you to be the spokesperson and say, hey, here's what we did and here's what we're doing. That's why Mrs. McCrary, I met with her just before the reunion up there this year when I met you. And we sat down for 2 or 3 hours and I asked her more questions. And so I think the other thing is in reading Jerry Gill's stuff, it's pretty good. But here's one major point that I would want to make. In some of the writings about Jimma, they indicate that in about 1955 or 56, there was a little bit of a turmoil with the students. And the Ethiopian government got in it because I think at one time they must have suspended all the students. Have you read about that?
No.
Well, they suspended a whole group of students, and they had a political fight that I understand involved the governments, probably in both countries. And I inquired of Mrs. Murray and Mrs. McCrary as to what was the real cause of that. Because in some cases, I think faculty wanted to accuse faculty and administrators wanted to accuse administrators. And what Mrs. Murray and Mrs. McCrary told me was the communists were really working on the students behind the scenes. Because some of the students have told me and they told them, when we said, what in the world did you do this for? And they said they were messing with our head. And what they meant was there were political factions over there who did not want the Americans to be successful. So whether some of them want to agree with me on that or not, I'm just telling you, partner, that is up front, talking to the Ethiopians and talking to the people that were there. And I always wanted to know for sure what caused this little bit of uprising. And we were facing political factions the whole time we were there. The Russians didn't necessarily want us to be in there and be successful.
Did those did those students during that uprising, did they become the leaders of the Communist Party?
Okay. Again, on some of this, all I know is what I read because it was written after we came home. And that's why I wanted to go back again and interview Mrs. Murray and Mrs. McCrary. Now, the McCrarys went back over, they were in Jimma and later at Amalai, or Alamai, however you pronounce it. And so I wanted to know, what did they think really caused the uprising? And they said it was students who were politically being influenced by other factions. Now, whether any of those students went on, I don't know, we'd have to find some now. When we were there, I think the average life expectancy of an Ethiopian male was 32 years. Now, I hope some of them are as old as I am or older, and I do not know which ones are left.
Mm-hmm. Personally, how do you feel what happened to Ethiopia as it developed and as the troubles happened, and now it's getting back to being where it was in the 1950s, where a stable government.
Yeah,
how do you feel about the development of Ethiopia?
No question, the development of Ethiopia throughout recorded history has been impacted by whichever political faction was in power. I have to be careful now when I'm out here talking to Eritreans or Ethiopians, because for a while they were federated. Now Eritrea and Ethiopia are in conflict with each other. And so where I was very proud of Haile Selassie, I find a lot of people who don't like Haile Selassie, or a subsequent government tried to paint a picture that Haile Selassie was not a good person or a good leader. When in truth, if you really look at history, Haile Selassie, during his time, probably did more for Ethiopia than anybody else. So to answer your question, it's been unfortunate because whoever the governments were, they've not always had the masses of the people at heart. And as a result, the people have suffered. There have been famines. Mm-hmm. People starved to death. Disease over there, if they had the medical capability, they could eliminate the disease with just having a shot of penicillin. And so talk about a country that has never had a chance to really thrive and has had some really tough times of upheaval. Ethiopia is one of those places. But like we felt when we were there and after we came home, it's a paradise, just sitting there waiting for the right time for someone to bring them the right government and use their natural resources. And I think it could just be developed into really something else. Now, is it going to happen in my lifetime? It hadn't happened yet. Though it's really interesting to get on there and look at pictures, the pictures we saw at the reunion, if you saw the slide presentation, look at pictures of modernization, and you got McDonald's and other places are in there. You see the people are wearing American style clothing, Western clothing we'll call it. So those are real switches and real changes.
Well, I just want to thank you for your time today. Allow me to come into your office. I know you're a pretty busy guy. Thank you for allowing me to interview you, and hopefully we can schedule another roundabout. We can talk about your basketball experiences. And
I'd be happy to do that. If I think of anything else about Ethiopia, you had a good group of questions there. So in closing with you, I want everyone to know, I've had some of these people, and they'll know who I'm talking about if they ever watch this. Some of these people that were there after us say, well, they're this guy and that guy are regarded as royalty in Ethiopia. Well, I'll tell you what, some of the others of us might be too. We're just not alive anymore. Mm-hmm. So I just want people to listen to us when we say, wait a minute here, here's what it was really like. I do know that most anybody who's ever been over there, they want to put on their resume they were in Jimma. You check it. You go read everything you can read, and they'll say, well, so-and-so was in Jimma. Well, they got there about 1956 or after, and there's the ones that were really there. And just an amazing, remarkable bunch of men. Mr. Lewis, I understand, went over to the Northeastern Tahlequah, was a professor for a long time. I've not found him. I'd like to find his kids to see if they're still alive. But just a remarkable bunch of men. I've gone online and tried to find things. I don't know if they ever wrote their stories or not. I may be able to do that using the letters and all the things that I've collected. And then Mrs. McCrary came to me at a reunion 4 or 5 years back, and she said, here are all of my husband's stuff, you know, books and things that are reports that they wrote in Ethiopia. And I had told the story about how Alamaya was actually selected and how it got to be at Alamaya. And I told some of them that originally it was not going to be there. But then David Davis cleared it up when he said his dad found water down there, and that's what determined where it would be. So let's get David's stuff in too. He's supposed to be right now. We were on the email this week. And when we get both of us together, then we'll get with you again.
Oh, definitely. Appreciate it.